I am deeply sorry that anyone suffered abuse in the church. While I cannot take away those memories and that pain, I have promised and am committed to walking with you on the road to healing. And that involves more than any financial settlement. You do not have to walk alone.
Well, hello. Welcome back to episode 6 of Raised Catholic Philosophy. I'm Cannistraro. At my old age of 74, I'm trying to finally figure out, get straight, my worldview, which has been largely influenced by my Roman Catholic upbringing. And even though I've largely moved on from being a practicing Catholic, or what people would consider a believing Catholic, I still identify as a Catholic because that's how I was imprinted as a child. That's where my values come from. And to a large degree, that's where my worldview belief proclivities come from. Because I find that even though I've largely moved on, I consider myself an enlightened person in the sense of the Enlightenment with the rise of science. And I consider myself scientifically oriented. I see that I'm really open to a transcendent context for science. I'm really open to that. I don't really know if there's anything to it, but I use metaphysics as my context. Now, metaphysical concepts have largely replaced theological ones from my youth. And with this episode, I'm inaugurating a third type of episode, which I call Raised Catholic Memoir. I'll be telling some stories from my youth of how I remember being imprinted as a Catholic, where my worldview was formed, this worldview that has stuck with me, that I can't shake, that I've come to accept as, well, I'm stuck with it. I'm stuck with it. And I want to preserve as much of it as I reasonably can and harmonize it with my enlightened view, which is mostly scientifically based. But my worldview leaves me open to the transcendent. I really want to see the scientific worldview within a wider one of transcendence, because the reason is I don't feel that the scientific worldview is adequate for explaining concepts like consciousness, the introspective feeling that I have that there is something more to reality than what our senses allow us to see, even with the aid of scientific instruments. That's the sort of thing I'll be exploring in Raised Catholic Philosophy. Now, about the other two types of episodes we'll be doing. One is about worldview issues, or concepts and ideas that often play into a person's worldview. For example, episode 3 was called Transcendental Allergies. And it had to do with the reluctance on the part of some people, many people, to validate the concept of transcendence. Some people are open to it, and some people reject it and are afraid of it as indicating that they might be something less than enlightened. Another example, we did an episode on sacred writings. I asked the question, why do so many modern people today, consider ancient sacred writings factual? That was a little bit edgy, and I'm hoping to get a discussion going about that. Now, another type of episode that you'll see on Raised Catholic Philosophy, and in fact, the main type of episode that you will see, will be panel discussions of another podcast, my favorite science, or I should say science and philosophy podcast, called Theories of Everything, TOE, T-O-E, Theories of Everything with Curt Jaimungal. This is mainly a science podcast, but Curt Jaimungal, who was a young physicist who has a very scientific, mathematical, scientific orientation, is, I believe, like me, open to a wider context for science. That he may not use the word transcendence, but he's not a proponent of scientism. I don't believe. Scientism is a worldview where one gives primacy to what is scientific, what is scientifically demonstrable. Things that are scientifically demonstrable are worthy of belief. Things that are not scientifically demonstrable in this view, as I take it, are not really trustworthy. So science reigns supreme. It has to be provable using scientific method. Otherwise, it's questionable or unproven. So that's a worldview that is very, very popular right now among scientists, and it's not one that I share. And it's what distinguishes me from a lot of people. Just as I have moved on from a theological worldview to one that's more metaphysical, which is wider, I've also moved on from, in my adult life, where I had been more scientific exclusively. I now look at a wider context. So I don't believe in scientism. That's what distinguishes me. And I believe Curt is the same way. But he has a science show, and he talks to the biggest minds that he can get onto his show, talking about the most fundamental questions having to do with reality from a scientific perspective. But he also goes into a philosophical or metaphysical discussion every now and then. So we'll be doing panel discussions of some of these TOE podcasts on an ongoing basis. We've already done 3 discussions on one TOE podcast where Curt interviewed Matt O'Dowd, who you might be familiar with. He used to host a PBS Spacetime, which is a purely scientific show where explains, using great scripts and great illustrations, explains basic concepts, for the most part, in physics. So Matt came on to talk about his project, which is a movie about the nature of reality, a documentary about the nature of reality, as best as can be determined scientifically, with a nod toward metaphysics. At this time, that is the project that Matt O'Dowd was promoting on TOE. And I and 3 discussion partners discussed that show. And that's our episodes 1, 2, and 5. So I hope you'll look for those, and I hope you'll subscribe to this podcast and comment, like, and all the things that will help me build my audience. So that's enough for preliminaries. So stick around for the main event. Conscience, mine and the bishop's, both made in Brooklyn. Be right back. Okay, now let's get to it. Conscience, mine and the bishop's, both made in Brooklyn. This will be a bit of memoir on my part. So to begin with, let's talk about how my conscience was formed, which I believe is typical of the way other young Catholic consciences were formed at that time. There was a concept called age of reason, around the age of 7. And there was some very important rituals and milestones that a Catholic youth would experience at that time, involving, first of all, guilt, or the ability to feel guilt, or the ability to feel guilty for not having done the right thing, feel guilty for having done the wrong thing. You're introduced to moral precepts like the 10 Commandments, church rules, things of that nature. And it's determined, first of all, whether or not the child has, in fact, achieved the age of reason. So there's a if you go to a Catholic school, this is a daily occurrence. Every day, the nun, typically it will be a nun in first grade, would spend some time teaching you what needed to be taught regarding going to your first confession, which was what you did once it was determined that you had reached the age of reason. So to go to your first confession, you had to have a sense of having done right or wrong, primarily wrong, a sense of guilt, a desire to confess the wrongdoing that you've done, the wrongdoing that rises to the level of being sinful, and therefore there's a need to confess that sin in order to begin to erase the consequences. The eternal, I might add, the eternal, possibly eternal consequences of having committed the sin. So just imagine 7 years old. I don't think it happens today, and for a good reason. But back then, this was standard, and it had been standard, I believe, for decades, or perhaps centuries. I don't know the history of it. But you're in first grade, you're a child, you're introduced to the idea of sin, and you're instructed by the nun, and you're quizzed, and at some point, the pastor comes in, and the pastor gives you an interview and decides whether or not you have achieved the age of reason, whether or not you can have your first confession, and then, ta-da, go to your first mass, where you participate fully, and you, quote, receive First Holy Communion. A big deal, a big deal. It's a big family affair. Usually there are communion parties, communion gifts. It's a milestone for a child, for a Catholic child. At least it was at that time, to have First Holy Communion. So what's involved in this age of reason thing? Well, what's involved is an appreciation that there are consequences for your sins. What are the consequences? Well, the consequences are the need to confess those sins to another person, a priest, always a priest, in order to be forgiven for the sins, which is stage one. So here's how a confession works, in case you didn't know. Typically on a Saturday, anybody who wants to go to confession could usually do it on a Saturday, go to a church in which were installed several confessional booths. And in those confessional booths, there were three compartments, one in the middle for the priest, and two others, one on each side of the priest for the penitents, as they were called. The penitents would sit in a pew first and think about what they wanted to confess, what they needed to confess. They would go through what was called an examination of conscience. Conscience. Examination of conscience, see what arises, see what wrongdoing you've done. It doesn't have to be an action. It could be a thought. It could be a wish. It could be an intention. It doesn't have to be an overt action, but see what needs to be confessed. And then you look around and find a priest who you think will be friendly to you, not make you feel too bad, because the confessionals usually had the names of the priests who were sitting inside. So you go into one of the side compartments, kneel down, try not to listen to the confession that's being given on the other side, in the other booth. And eventually a little door, you're in the dark, by the way, you're totally in the dark. The priest is going to be in the dark. A little door will open, and you're separated by a wire grill from the priest, who may be falling asleep at this point, because especially if there are a lot of kids, he's heard it all before, it's probably all the same, and he's having a hard time staying awake. So you say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been, let's say, 1 week since my last confession." And the priest will say, "Well, tell me your sins, my child," or something like that. And you already know what you're going to say. You disobeyed your parents 5 times. You disobeyed the teachers 5 times. You didn't do your homework once, whatever it is. It could be something, more significant than that. Maybe you stole some candy from the candy counter in the store. Something like, that's a typical thing that a kid might feel a need to confess to. The priest might ask questions to try to understand better what was done or not done. In the case of stealing, he might tell the penitent that he or she has to make restitution. Might say, "Go back and pay for it," or might say, "Put the value of the candy in the poor box," or something like that. And then the priest would give penance. It's like a sentence to say prayers. He might say, "Okay, for your sins, I want you to say 3 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys." These are standard prayers that Catholics used to at least know how to say by rote. And after the confession, you would go sit in the pew and mentally recite these prayers the required number of times. And before you left, you'd have to recite a prayer called an act of contrition, which is a formal declaration of your sorrow to God. You're telling God that you're sorry for having offended Him, and you promise to do your best not to sin anymore, good luck. But at that point, you go sit in the pew and you do your penance, and maybe you go maybe put some money in the poor box to pay back the candy you stole. And at that point, you've been forgiven. Hey, what do you do? What the priest doesn't remind you of, but which you know from having been instructed, is that, hey, that's not all there is. You have to pay atonement for your sins. Atonement is kind of a prison sentence, but rather than serving your time in prison, you serve it in a state called purgatory, which is really described as a place. When I was a child, a place that was just like the place called hell, except hell was permanent, forever and ever and ever, and purgatory was not. And both were characterized by non-consuming fire. Imagine that, 7 years old. Non-consuming fire, meaning you'd have to withstand being burned. You couldn't get away from it, being burned, and you're not going to die from it. The pain's not going to go away. It's going to last until you pay your debt. For how long? Well, here's a hint. There used to be and it may still be a practice called indulgences. We've heard, people are usually familiar with the idea of the sale of indulgences, which led to the Reformation. In large part, that was a contributing factor. But indulgences still existed and were advertised when I was a child. You could, for doing certain pious practices, like making a pilgrimage, saying certain prayers, doing certain good works that were desirable, making big contributions maybe to the building of a church, in prior times going on the crusades. Hey, you got big indulgence for that. Well, if a local bishop would be authorized to say, if you do these practices, you're granted an indulgence of X number of days of early release from purgatory. Now, a small indulgence, the smallest ones I can remember, and they were rare, were 25 days. That's tiny. A larger and more common small one was 40 days. Typically, 100 days indulgence, or maybe 300 days. That was a big one. So this tells you what they want you to think, what they're trying to convey of regarding the length of this prison, this purgatory sentence, what it would be. So it was not a pleasant thing to think about, and it was a good incentive to do what you had to do to get indulgences, so that if you were lucky enough to die right away, you wouldn't have to suffer in purgatory, which is a weird thing, a weird thought to have. There was also a type of indulgence called plenary indulgence, which meant it wiped off all your debt. So that's when you really thought about, hey, if I can get hit by a bus on the way home, I've got it made forever and ever. Amen. It's hard to imagine, but I'm telling you it's true. And anybody my age who went to Catholic school will tell you it's true. Hard to believe, but it's true. Now, the other kind of sin, besides the normal, everyday kind of sin that a child might commit, is a mortal sin. The ordinary sins were called venial, not mortal. The mortal sins are merited. Hang on. They merited going to hell. If you died without having confessed a mortal sin and having been forgiven for a mortal sin, you're destined for Hell forever and ever and ever. Amen. Hard to imagine that somebody that an adult would impose that thought in a child. Now get this. One of the ways to commit a mortal sin, the easiest way, is don't go to church on Sunday. You believe it? Don't go to church on Sunday. Mortal sin. The only way to get out of that is you had to go to church, but there were rules of thumb of how late you could get there and how early you could leave, and still being able to say that you attended the mass. So you could, if you played it smart, you could reduce your time at the service by about, you can probably reduce it 40%. So it's important. I mean, you don't want to go to hell. Neither do you want to spend the whole hour you have to in church. So there's a way to work that. So this is the gateway to forming a conscience. Now there are also positive aspects of forming a conscience. They encourage you to be of good character, do the right thing, and by doing that you could earn rewards. You could earn your own, to a certain extent, your own reduction in penitential time in purgatory. It's like giving yourself an indulgence if you do good works with the right intention. Or get this, you can help your friends by doing good works and offering the benefits to your deceased friends, your deceased relatives. If they're stuck in purgatory, you can do good works and reduce their time in purgatory. It's like an eternal reward and punishment brokerage that the church was running. And I think it was a good business plan. It worked for a long time. People bought it for a long time. Eventually, it came to an end. Now, that's not the whole thing. It's not just first confession. There's also the first communion that follows that, which is a full participation in the Mass. You had to receive communion. You had to be free of sin. You had to have all your sins forgiven. So to go to Mass on Sunday and participate fully by receiving communion, you had to typically go to confession on Saturday, unless you could say you didn't commit any sins during the week. Good luck with that. Then a few years later, around the age of 13, early adolescence, there was another ritual called confirmation, which was kind of a positive thing. You would study the Catholic faith a little bit more. You demonstrate a deeper knowledge of the Catholic faith, and you demonstrate a willingness to suffer personally, and if you're a boy, die to defend the Catholic faith. That's what they told me when I was 13. The big enemy at that time were the Chinese communists and the Mohammedans. I didn't know what the Mohammedans, what they were, and now they're called Muslims. But the nuns who were not very well educated and not very well traveled were talking about the Mohammedans. They were probably thinking of the Crusades. And for some reason, the Chinese communists were on their minds. They had the idea the Chinese communists would come to the United States and desecrate the churches. And it would be my job to run up to the altar while the soldiers are in the church, ready to destroy the church. And I would take the consecrated host, the Blessed Sacrament it was called, that was kept in a tabernacle on the altar for distribution during Mass and communion. It's a long story what that is, but these are very sacred objects, and they're edible. So it will be my job to consume these things, these hosts, as they shot me. That was a scenario that I was left with. That would be with the purpose of being confirmed, to have that kind of character, to be able to do that. And if you were a girl, your job was to preserve your purity. That was your main job. Okay, so this is how my conscience was formed in this ritual, this procedure that was typical, I believe, of all Catholic parishes in the United States, and in particular where I grew up, in the parish in the Diocese of Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn, New York. So much for my conscience. Now the bishops. The bishop in this case is the bishop of the diocese where I happen to live in upstate New York, the Diocese of Albany, which includes several, I think 14 counties in upstate New York. The bishop's name is Edward B. Scharfenberger. And guess what? He's from Brooklyn too. And guess what? He's just about my age. I think he's about 8 months older than I am. And guess what? I was born in a hospital in Bushwick, and I went to Catholic school in Bushwick. And Bishop Scharfenberger, it is said on the internet, I haven't double-checked this, but it says on the internet, he was born in Bushwick. Now, there weren't many hospitals in Bushwick. Only one that I know of. Possibly, we were born within 8 months of each other at the same hospital in Bushwick. And although he moved around, as I understand it, he didn't just live in one parish or two parishes. He lived in Brooklyn and also in Queens, two different boroughs of New York City. They both comprised the Diocese of Brooklyn. So I could say that the bishop and I probably went through the same ordeal, or the same process of having our consciences formed through Catholic school. He went to Catholic schools, through the first Holy Communion, first confession ritual, through the confirmation ritual. Now he went on to a preparatory school for boys who wanted to become priests, and I did not. But at least through elementary school, we had the same type of formation of conscience. And I think this is what gives me the right to comment on it. I think we went through the same ordeal, and we started out the same. We started out babies, knowing nothing. We started out infants, born in the same hospital in Bushwick, possibly the same hospital in Bushwick. So in that sense, I feel I'm the bishop's peer in this respect. Now, I went on to become the kind of maverick who would make a video like this, and he went on to become a bishop, which is basically a journeyman clergyman in the Catholic Church. He has the full powers, the full sacramental powers, and the basic powers of authority of a bishop. Beyond that, there is just basically cardinals who are able to elect a pope, and the pope, those are higher levels substantially. The bishop is basically the highest level of clergyman in the Catholic Church. So why am I talking about Bishop Scharfenberger now? Well, as I'm sure just about everybody knows, there has been a series of revelations about child abuse involving priests, and not just priests, but mostly priests in positions of trust in the Catholic Church over the past several decades. And this started with about 2 decades ago with some investigative reporting that was done at the Boston Globe, and they kind of broke the story that this was a big deal in areas of the United States. And that opened the floodgates. People started coming forward about having been abused as children. Then district attorneys started to get involved, doing investigations, doing prosecutions. And now in New York, there is a law that opened a window for adults to look back to their childhoods and see if they want to, if they remember any incidents of child abuse against themselves that they wanted to sue the Catholic Diocese for, or anybody else in civil court. So right now there's a lot of civil lawsuits being negotiated, some being settled, some going to be going to court. And the reason why Scharfenberger, Bishop Ed, he likes to be called Bishop Ed, the reason why Bishop Ed was in the news was he was the 5th diocesan bishop to decide to declare bankruptcy as a result of lawsuits that he's dealing with. There are about 450, I think, lawsuits against the Diocese of Albany at this time. Many have been settled, but Bishop says they're out of cash. If they keep settling, they're going to have to start firing people, not make payroll. They're going to have to start reducing their level of service to the members of the diocese, the parishioners. So he decided now is the time to file for bankruptcy, which basically hold everything. Everything is on hold, and the bankruptcy wheels of justice, if that's the right word, will begin to turn. And it may be years before justice is done to the remaining litigants. Now, I opened this episode with a clip of Bishop Ed's official apology that appears on the diocese website. And he does make a very sincere apology apparently a very sincere apology to the victims and their families. He apologizes to the church in general. And he makes a good case that he's sorry that so many people had to suffer what he calls the scourge of child abuse. The scourge of child abuse. And what irked me, and what irked many of the plaintiffs who commented on this apology, was that it was lacking in a sense of forthrightness about what the crime is, what the wrongdoing is in this case. The Diocese of Albany isn't being sued because the bishop was guilty of child abuse. No, he's being sued because the institutional church looked the other way, in a sense, or tried not to put the spotlight on the wrongdoings that were done by their own priests, tried to sweep it under the rug, tried to avoid publicity, tried to avoid reporting this wrongdoing to the authorities, and instead resorted to things like counseling and reassignment, treatment and reassignment. And these priests will get reassigned to a different place. People would not be told, hey, watch out. This guy has screwed up in the past, to use a euphemism. Keep an eye on him. No. And these priests were able to become repeat offenders. The main motivation seemed to be preserving the reputation of the church. Now that is, to my way of thinking, to my conscience that was formed in Brooklyn, New York, like Bishop Ed was in the 1950s and early 60s, that's not doing the right thing. That's not showing character. That's not showing what they would call the charism of confirmation. That's being a coward. Well, maybe it's just doing the easy thing, the practical thing. Maybe it's just doing what the lawyers say is what needs to be done to avoid exposing all the parishes, as well as the diocese, to not only to bankruptcy, but to going out of business. Because there are so many litigants, potentially, all the parishes could wind up having to sell their property, and basically there'd be no churches left. And I think this is what Bishop Ed is trying to avoid. And he's doing that in part by telling a whopper of a lie. He claims that the Diocese of Albany, he, the bishop, has no control over what happens in the parishes. They're all independent, and legally they are by New York religious incorporation law, I think it's called. They are separately incorporated. They're separate legal entities. But the fact is that law recognizes the authority of the bishop or whatever religion is involved. The law doesn't seek to interfere with the practices of the religion. And if the religion, if in that religion the bishop has authority over the parishes, the religious incorporation law does not interfere with that. The bishop basically hires the priest. The bishop basically is in charge. The bishop basically, there is no real independence among the parishes. This is a lie. Everybody knows it. But I think he's doing it because he feels he has to do that in order to avoid potentially putting the whole complex of dioceses and parishes out of business. Unfortunately, to give you the full context, I have to introduce another character and another scandal. The other character is the person who Bishop Ed Scharfenberger replaced. His name is Bishop Howard Hubbard. He's now Mr. Hubbard because by his own request, he was dismissed from the clerical estate, as they say. He was embroiled in scandal before Bishop Ed was brought on the scene to try to clean things up. Now, Bishop Howard Hubbard has been bishop for a long time. He has a stellar reputation, or he had a stellar reputation in this area of upstate New York. He started out as a priest who brought very needed and effective social services to a sector of the Albany community that really needed it. He became known as a street priest. At any rate, he became a young, I guess, liberal bishop of the Albany Diocese, had a great reputation. But when the floodgates opened and people started bringing forth accusation against the priests for child abuse, Howard Hubbard's name came up. And he had a couple of accusations from the distant past, which he denied. The diocese wound up hiring a law firm to investigate independently, objectively, and let the evidence lead where it might. And it turned out that the accusations were now proven, and they were effectively dropped, at least and forgotten for at least a while. But then other accusations were made, and eventually litigation was brought forth. And I'm not sure if there were any criminal charges, but there was civil litigation for sure. And in court, giving testimony that he did not expect to ever be made public, he admitted some cover-up of not of his own misdeeds, but of other priests. He admitted that he did not make public some accusations against priests. They wound up being counseled, treated, reassigned. Nobody was told, and they were able to continue misbehaving, if that's the right word. So that brought further scandal on Bishop Hubbard, and he decided at some point he didn't want to continue to bring embarrassment to the church, so he asked to be clericalized or declericalized, defrocked, I guess is the word, which they did. So now he's Mr. Hubbard. But I had to bring Howard Hubbard's name into this because he figures very, very strongly not only into this scandal of cover-up with child abuse, but there's another mass litigation going on that's impacted by this bankruptcy that Bishop Scharfenberger recently announced. That has to do with a pension fund. This may get a little bit technical, but it's interesting. A pension fund for a Catholic hospital that wound up being merged with another hospital that was not a Catholic hospital. The merger took place at the direction of the New York State Department of Health that was trying to consolidate in an efficient way its medical facilities around the state. So St. Clair's Hospital is the Catholic hospital that basically no longer exists because it was merged into Ellis Hospital. And the employees there who were part of a pension fund, in order to preserve that pension fund and have it continue to be available to serve those employees of the former St. Clair's Hospital, a deal was made in 2008 at the time of the merger. A deal was made for the state of New York to supply to the organization that ran the pension fund $28.5 million to help it meet its financial obligation to the pension fund members, the employees, going forward. Now, for some reason, I don't know what the reason is. I don't know if anybody knows what the reason is, but that money was never actually deposited into the pension fund itself. It was used for other purposes, which I understand people are assuming are legitimate purposes. So there's no suggestion of corruption, but that money never got put in a position to actually pay benefits to the employees, the pension members. And that finally came out, and there's litigation now. The state of New York is assisting the employees, as a matter of fact, to have their day in civil court to see what they can do to get money out of the diocese. That's who they're suing, the diocese, to make them whole. Now, here's the interesting thing. Number one, Howard Hubbard was the head of the board of trustees of that pension fund. Bishop Ed, when he was brought on board, also became a member of the board of trustees or board of directors of that pension fund. And when they were sued, diocese was sued, they used the technical excuse, hey, don't sue us, sue the pension fund. Don't sue the diocese, sue the pension fund. They are a separate entity, which is the same claim that the diocese is making now that is being sued by the litigants for child abuse. Now, they are, what they're saying in that case is the same claim in this respect. By being particular about which board of trustees is responsible for what entity, they are trying to minimize the amount of money that is eligible for being distributed by a bankruptcy court. They're trying to protect, in the case of the child abuse litigants, the bishop is saying, well, the parishes are separate. The parishes are all on their own. So if you're going to sue anybody, just sue us, the diocese, and the diocese doesn't have many assets compared to the parishes. Now, in the case of the pension fund, they're saying, don't sue us, sue the pension fund. The pension fund really has no assets. If you sue us, you'll go into our assets. We don't want that. So they're using kind of the same technical excuse in both cases. So this is relevant to the area of conscience, because the people making these claims, although they're making these claims on legal advice, no doubt, they're making the claims themselves. And the question is, what, to be frank, what's a sin? What is a sin? What is a sin? And is it okay to lie in the legal arena? Is it okay? Is it okay to use these lies to deprive the litigants of what they're entitled to legally, potentially? That's where the element of conscience comes in. And to be a little more explicit about it, at the expense of using embarrassing language, embarrassing concepts, here I am, a 74-year-old man, going back in my own mind, age 7, when I made my first confession, for example, and I learned the concept of good and evil, guilt. And then when I was a little bit older and I made my confirmation, where I was supposed to become a person of a good character and do the right thing, even if it hurt, even if it hurt badly, do the right thing. And I put myself in the position of somebody like Bishop Ed. What would I do? On the one hand, you have these practical concerns about the institutional church that you want to preserve. On the other hand, there's all these little petty sins that I confessed and I felt I would go to purgatory for, if not hell. These terrifying concepts that basically, were instilled in me. This is where my worldview, not literally, comes from, but is very, very strongly influenced by. The idea of doing right and wrong, not doing wrong, doing right, and the idea of having good character to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing. That I'm sure Bishop Hubbard, as well as Bishop Scharfenberger, coming from the same diocese in Brooklyn, the same time I was growing up, no doubt he had the same catechism. He had the same prayer books. He went through the same procedures to pass his test to be able to make his first confession or first communion. How do you wind up being in a position like that as an official representative of the church at the highest rank, effectively, bishop, and tell these bold-faced lies? How do you do that? He should at least talk about it. Now, I read somewhere recently that in order to find suitable candidates for bishop, the Vatican has a form that they ask the local diocese to pass around and ask people in the know, priests primarily, maybe some very active lay Catholics, ask them to make recommendations for, well, we need to elevate somebody to bishop. Who do you think we should elevate? Who should we keep an eye on? And for guidance, they say, look, we don't want anybody who rocks the boat. The main job of the bishop is to preserve the tradition of Catholicism. That's the main job, really, functionally, is to keep it going. So don't give us a name of somebody who wants to ordain women priests or someone who wants to liberalize our views on homosexuality or anything like that might be in the news now, might be current. We want people who are very, very traditional, who think well inside the box. So I think they got that in Bishop Ed, and I think that might be his motivation. No doubt he is following legal advice from competent counsel that they're paying good money for. He's getting the same legal advice that anybody else would give. But it's up to him by him I mean Bishop Ed, to follow his conscience if he wants to, if he can, or rationalize it somehow. Rationalize his not following what would appear to be a well-informed conscience, and just do what he has to do with the intention of preserving the church in the churches in his diocese. If I were in his position, I'd have a hard time deciding. I think I wouldn't be in this position. No way would I be in this position. Could I be in this position? But I can see how he would be torn. But he has to be such a bold-faced liar in the process. I think he's embarrassing himself. That's my commentary on my conscience and the bishops. It's easy for me to take pot shots. It's easy for me to criticize the bishop. I don't have any responsibility toward Catholic churches, the Catholic Church, the Catholic tradition. I have no responsibility to preserve it, but he does, and he takes it seriously. But it's hard to be perfect. It's impossible to be perfect. Perfection is really out of reach. Now I'm going to show in a moment a clip of the end of that statement that Bishop Ed made, which I thought was quite a stretch. And it is, he sympathizes with people who are made uncomfortable by the revelation of child abuse in the church and all this litigation going on, and not sure what's going to happen. I'm probably thinking a lot of people really see what's going on and really see that maybe the parishes are going to have to pay the bill, and maybe a lot of the parishes are going to have to close down because they're going to have to sell their churches to pay these claims. So in order to motivate people to have strength and move on, he uses the example of Jesus anticipating his crucifixion and death. And there's a story told in Scripture about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. So let me play that clip, and I'll come back and comment on it.
care. I want to listen to your stories if you are willing to share. And to all our faith family, our clergy, our religious, and our parishioners, I understand that you may be experiencing fear and uncertainty, but I also have hope. Hope that we are not walking alone. God is with us, walking with us. It may help to remember that Jesus struggled too in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his crucifixion. He prayed, desperately asking his Father to take this cup from him. But God said no. Jesus responded, "Not my will be done, but yours be done." And he walked forward into the fear and then through the fear. Through his crucifixion came new life. With God, I pray that we can all experience new life on the path forward, growing stronger together.
So I said it was quite a stretch because Bishop Ed, he paints a picture of the entire community suffering because of this, including himself, the clergy, the victims, their families. Everybody is suffering because of this. They all have anxiety. And he wraps it all up in this powerful imagery of Jesus. They call it the Agony in the Garden. When I was a child, that painting was up in my parents' bedroom. My mother used to tell me the story that, and this is I think this is mentioned in one of the Synoptic Gospels, that Jesus was so afraid that he was sweating blood. It was as if he was sweating blood. And not a child. It's so powerful. And then, of course, you know the rest of the story. The beating, the scourging, the stations, the walking, carrying the cross and falling, all of this being nailed up. It's horrible. It's horrible. And the image is that he knows what's coming. And it's a pathetic picture. And whether you think that the scripture is 100% factual, or you think it's partly factual, you think it's inspired by something real, or you think it's mythical and legendary, or you think it's just good, important literature, everybody can understand the power of that story. And you can see the art that is inspired. The painting of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is a renowned painting. That crucifixion by Velázquez, I think it is renowned for its beauty. And so even the art, even the liturgical art, kind of reinforces the power of that story. He wraps himself up in it. Now, it's legitimate in that, one of his roles is he's a pastor. As a matter of fact, he once visited, it's a big deal, he once visited the local parish here and received a lot of coverage. And one of the points that he made when he was here was that he's a pastor. He sees himself as being a pastor, which kind of contradicts what he's saying now, that I have no control over the parishes. But anyway, it's legitimate. And in that context, he's giving spiritual comfort, spiritual guidance to parishioners. At the same time, he's wrapping himself up in it. But it just strikes me as a pie, really, in a sense, given the fact that he's not just a pastor. I mean, he's the perpetrator. He's the perpetrator. I mean, he's the one. He's representing the perpetrators who are church officials. The bad guys, whoever they are, countenance just counseling or treating the priests who were abusing children and transferring them. Just transferring them. That's the wrongdoing. That's what they're in trouble for. If they have to pay millions of dollars, that's what it's for. In part, is to give some kind of comfort and compensation to the victims. It's also to punish them, to have people learn a lesson. So he's wearing two hats here. Well, he's only wearing actually the pastor's hat, but actually, what he's not showing is he's also a perpetrator. Same thing with the pension fund scandal. he was a member of the board of trustees. He was the honorary chairman, I believe, after Bishop Hubbard had to step down, and he made decisions. He made decisions that were incompetent. He appointed members of the board. He and Hubbard both appointed members to the board of trustees who had no expertise, were all incompetent. They were all in over their heads. And once the crap hit the fan, they probably just kept on making things worse, kept on digging, trying to make sure that the bad news about the fiscal mismanagement wasn't made public. But the merger, because of the merger, things went out in the open, just like with the child abuse. It was, everything was kept quiet for a while. Certainly, priests, once they're in the business for a while, they know that they have a problem. They must hear stories that there were priests in all the parishes, and many of the parishes were picking on kids. It's kind of part of the culture. And they must know that they have the problem that the priesthood is attracting people with those sorts of temperaments that want to take advantage of the fact that they have positions of trust, and they're able to exploit that to get their sexual satisfaction in the way they need to. So I call it a pious distraction. I call it a pious distraction, that whole sermon, where he connects the dots in a very convenient way. Yes, it provides comfort to believing victims and so on, but it's mainly as a distraction. He's not saying, I'm sorry for what I did. No, he's saying, I'm sorry for what happened. I'm sorry for what happened to you. He should be saying, I'm sorry for what we did. I'm sorry for what we did in the child abuse scandal. And I'm sorry for what we did in screwing up the pension fund. Maybe that's too much to expect. Now, I just said some pretty harsh sounding words, and I feel I should put it into a wider, more accurate, more realistic concept. I mean, it wasn't just priests in the Catholic churches who were abusing children. This is a problem with human nature. I do not understand the psychological problem. I don't understand it, right? I do know that it exists, and it exists in all cultures, as far as I know. In some cultures, people know about it and talk about it openly, and in others, they pretend it doesn't exist. For a long time, in this culture, we pretended it didn't exist. I'm talking about child abuse. Until the news media latched onto it, and then it became not only a good public service, but it became a good story to sell newspapers. So you can't keep it under the rug anymore. People are going to talk about it whenever they find out about it and expose it. But it wasn't, once the floodgates broke, it wasn't just the Catholic churches that had the problem. It was all churches where you have clergymen in positions of trust. It was all the religions that were investigated. The dominoes keep on falling. And much more than the churches, there was the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts of America, last time I looked, they had bumping up against 100,000, I think, high 90s, call it 100,000 allegations of child abuse. They were destroyed. They weren't destroyed, but they had to sell a lot of property. They had to sell all that big Boy Scout camps to pay claims. I think that their numbers of members were cut in half, or maybe by more than half. Religions stopped affiliating with the Boy Scouts of America because they didn't want to be tarnished. So it's not just the Catholic Church, and it's much worse in other sectors. It's just a matter of opportunism, in my opinion. People who have this, I'll call it a temperament to be euphemistic about it, but people who have that temperament are going to naturally go to where they can express that temperament, and that would include the priesthood. It's just like if a person has a temperament for being an arsonist, it's not unusual. They become firemen, volunteer firemen, because maybe it's less difficult to get in. If you have a tendency toward violence, so maybe you go into police force or corrections or the military, if you want the opportunity to kill people and not get in trouble for it. It's just natural. It's just natural. It's a matter of human nature. But I think the church could take a lesson. It's too late now, but they could take a lesson from the way the Boy Scouts of America handled the problem. It's not a secret. They became totally laser focused on the problem, and I'm sure they've eliminated it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any members. No parent would be sending their kid to join the Boy Scouts after the scandal that everybody knows about that happened there. But I also want to mention, now that I'm talking about Boy Scouts, the American possession, I think it's whatever it is, Guam. People in Guam are American citizens. They have their own distinctive culture. They're very Catholic there. Now, there's a nexus between the Catholic Church and the Boy Scouts in Guam. When the crap hit the fan in Guam about child abuse, what they found was Boy Scouts of America were kind of working in cahoots with the Catholic Church, the altar boys, the priests who were in charge of or working with the altar boys. Prior to Vatican II, a lot of boys like myself, I was an altar boy. You would it's like belonging to a service organization or a club. You would assist in the mass and other liturgical services. It was a bit of an honor, and it was done in Latin. You had to be somewhat responsible. You're up there. You're part of the service. Everybody can see you. And what happened was a lot of the priests who were abusing altar boys were Boy Scout volunteers, Boy Scout scoutmasters, and things like that. And they actually were using the Boy Scouts as a way of recruiting altar boys to come in and then, do whatever was being done with the priests there. It's interesting. It's interesting. I will I'll put a couple of links in the description. So you can read about it. USA Today did extensive coverage of this. The Archbishop of the diocese, I don't know what it's called, but Guam has its own archdiocese. An archdiocese because it's the country is like 95% Catholic. He was implicated in this. He knew all about it. He got his ass handed to him. He was actually, not only was he defrocked, but he was also banned from Guam by the Vatican. I think they're doing that I think they're still paying him as bishop, probably so they can not pay him if he steps foot on Guam. But I'll put some links in the description about that story. It's interesting. As I've been putting this video together, I found myself thinking quite a lot about being a child and a young adolescent in Brooklyn. At that time, I had no concept of maybe even living to my age, of being in the mid-70s. I could never possibly imagine myself making a video like this, especially with the stance that I'm taking as an independent thinker. But what I'm doing isn't that difficult. I mean, you can see I'm an amateur at this, but I can learn how to do it better, and I will learn how to do it better, and there's no harm done. And on the other hand, I think about young future Bishop Ed at the same time. He might have been able to envision himself being a cleric. He could have envisioned himself being a bishop. He could have envisioned himself being a bishop in charge of a diocese, but he couldn't possibly envision the problems that he'd have to deal with, the real life problems he'd have to deal with as an executive, as a business manager, which he is, a business manager. He couldn't possibly know that. He couldn't know about the problem of child abuse that he would have to deal with in the future. He wouldn't know about having to be a pension fund manager. He wouldn't know any of that. And when he decided to go into this as a specialty in education, in other words, he was educated to be a priest. He wasn't trained in any of this stuff. I mean, I'm probably better prepared than he is, because I have a liberal arts background, and I have some business training as well. And I imagine that his training had more to do with the sermonizing and the philosophical aspect, the spiritual aspect of being a cleric and not being a business manager or an executive. So I feel sorry for him. And then I say to myself, well, this is where all the bullshit comes from. Not just Bishop Ed, not just Bishop Hubbard, but the whole Catholic hierarchy. They are not prepared, not trained to do a good job as executives and business managers. Number one. Number two, they're in an unchecked and unbalanced environment where they are king. I mean, they have no checks and balances. They have no one speaking truth to power. Whatever they say goes, and nobody really talks back to them, tells them that they're wrong. And they have this mantle of divine authority, divine inspiration. Pray, God is with us. That confidence that maybe it's warranted to a certain degree, but it didn't really eliminate the problems that they're dealing with now. So I feel sorry for them, and I see that their resort to bullshit is unfortunate, but it's probably going to keep on happening. I mean, there was bullshit involved in dealing with the child abuse crisis and trying to cover it up. There's bullshit involved in pretending you know how to manage a pension fund, and then when you screw it up, you try to cover it up. And now there's bullshit involved in dealing with it. It's probably inevitable, because at the same time that they're dealing with these problems that they don't really know how to handle, they have this very real sense of responsibility to keep this 2,000-year-old tradition going, and they don't want to be the ones who screw it up in a permanent way. So I feel sorry for them, but I do feel even sorrier for the victims. I feel naturally, inevitably. It's not a happy situation, but I wish everybody luck. Thanks for listening. See you next time.